Hello and welcome to the FPL tips video and podcast ahead of game week 14. My name's Rich and this is Fantasy Football Scout. Now, thanks a lot for all the nice comments last week. It was a bit of a strange one last week because we obviously previewed game week 13. However, we were doing it before game week 12 even commenced. So this is going to be a game week 14 tips video. And the deadline is obviously coming up in a few days' time. We're going to try and squeeze in 5 different tips this week, so a few more than normal. And we're going to try and keep it as concise as possible and use as much data as possible from the Fantasy Football Scout members area. So don't forget to like and subscribe. And thanks again for all the comments last week. So our first one, we're going to look at the suspension tightrope again. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. We're also going to look at Arsenal assets. They're going to be very, very popular ahead of the game week 14 deadline. We're going to discuss Zaha. He's been frustrating, but he's not been awful. So we're going to discuss what to do with him. Almiron, he was one we mentioned in one of the first tips videos I did. We compared him to players like in that 5 million range, and he was the standout. So again, we're going to discuss Almiron. And then captaincy for game week 14. Now, I know a lot of people are very, very sat on the captain, and that's going to be Haaland. But I definitely think it's at least worth a quick discussion anyway. And so let's get straight into it. So the first one, like I mentioned, we're going to revisit that suspension tightrope. So for those watching on the video, I'll put everything you need on screen. But also this is an audio podcast, so we will talk through exactly what we've got on screen. So I guess it's worth mentioning the World Cup's obviously coming up. So we've got 3 game weeks. Then there's the World Cup, and then we're going to get unlimited transfers anyway. So for the whole video, it's worth bearing in mind we've only got 3 game weeks to go. Now, the suspension tightrope, the reason that's important is because if a player gets to 5 yellow cards, they're going to miss that next game. So it's just worth being aware of, the players that are on that. So we've got a few Arsenal players. Well, the top 2 we've got here are Saliba and Jesus. They've both avoided a yellow card in the game week just gone. But if they were to pick up a yellow card this game week, they would miss the next one. Likewise, if they pick up a yellow card in 15, they're going to miss 16. So Saliba and Jesus is just worth being aware of, but we're going to get to Arsenal in a completely separate tip anyway. Then we've got Jacob Ramsey, Adam Smith of Bournemouth, Hickey and Tony. So Tony's a key one here, a bit like Jesus. He's a very, very popular striker. If he gets a yellow card, he's going to receive a ban. We've got McAllister of Brighton. Obviously, he's on penalties, so some may own him. Mark Gahey, Crystal Palace defender. He's been very popular in recent weeks, 4.3 million. Now, he just picked up a 4th yellow card, so it's worth being aware that he's a risk. So maybe someone like him, maybe it's not worth bringing him in now. If you own him, obviously just keep him. You're going to probably be rotating in between your starting 11 and your bench anyway. But maybe you want to look at other, cheap defenders. We've got Bobby Dicker of Dover Reed. We've got Harrison Reed, a popular 4.5 million midfielder who's scored a couple of goals this season. And Tete from Fulham. Bruno Fernandes has hit the list. So while he's, Man United are looking a little better recently, but it's just been worth being aware rather that, Bruno Fernandes is now on 4 yellows. And the same with Dalot. Dalot's become, he's not overly popular, but, if you're looking in that, Mark Gahey kind of cheap defender range, it's worth being aware that Dalot's on 4. Joe Linton and Fabian Schär, another popular cheap defender on 4 yellow cards. Then we've got a few Forest players, Cook, McKenna and Worrell, and then Bentancur from Tottenham as well. So yeah, it's just being worth, aware of those players that are on 4 yellow cards. The tip here is, how are we going to deal with that? So I'd say be aware of bringing in suspended players. Have a look at that list before you do your transfers. Like I say, there's a couple of key strikers there, Jesus and Tony. Also, all those cheap defenders, you're maybe going to bring them in to play them 1 or 2 game weeks. So just be aware, if a player's on the list, maybe don't go for it. If you've got a few players on this list, you may well want to try and roll a transfer this week if you can. I'd say there is an exception, and we're going to move into Arsenal assets anyway soon. Jesus, for example, or Saliba, they've got a fixture coming up that's very, very good in game week 14. And then we might be looking to move them on for 15 or 16. So Arsenal may be the exception, but just be aware of those players on this suspension tightrope. So as mentioned, we're going to move into Arsenal assets. Now, Arsenal have, so this money game, and it's been a money game for Brighton and Liverpool, and they've struggled against Forest. But yeah, Arsenal got Forest at home. So a lot of people are looking to bring in Arsenal assets this week. Now, what I've done, for people watching on the video, you can probably see. But for people listening, I've created a table using that Fantasy Football Scout members area. And I've sorted it basically by expected goal involvement. So that's where you combine your expected goals, your expected assists, and you get a number. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, this isn't non-penalty, the XGI number that I've come up with. So Saka has taken a penalty, so his is boosted slightly by about 0.73, I believe. But top of this list is actually Jesus. So Gabriel Jesus, he's on that suspension tightrope, but he's attacking threat-wise, he's the best Arsenal attacker, 7.3 XGI across those 11 games. To put that in perspective, Saka is the next one down at 5.89, followed by Martinelli at 4.96. Odegaard's only just slightly behind Martinelli at 4.52. And I mean, after those main four, so after Jesus, Saka, Martinelli and Odegaard, there's a substantial drop-off. So you get to Zaha at 2.64. Now, it's also worth mentioning, so after that Forest game, they've got Chelsea away and Wolves away. So Arsenal have obviously been very, very good this season, but it's two. So after this money fixture, this Forest fixture at home, Chelsea away is going to be tricky. Wolves away, I mean, I wouldn't want to say it's tricky, but, you know, Wolves don't concede a lot of goals. So Gabriel is probably a very, very good asset because he's at 1.57 XGI here, which is clear of all their other defenders. Saliba, for example, has a third of what Gabriel's putting up attacking-wise. And he's actually, so Gabriel's actually 0.1 cheaper. Gabriel's 5.1 and Saliba's 5.2. So if you're looking at a defender, I think what stands out here is Gabriel is probably the one to go for. I mean, Ben White, he's only 4.5 million and 1.13 XGI. So, I mean, maybe you could look at Ben White if it's, you know, just for, you basically don't have the money to get to Gabriel. But like I mentioned, the fixtures do get a little bit tougher after Forest. So I'd consider bringing them in now, but, you know, if you get to next game week, it's probably not going to be worth it. So I'd say with these Arsenal assets, it's now or never when we're looking at such a short time frame. And also, just to talk again about those attackers, I really would, despite Jesus being on the suspension tightrope that we just mentioned, if it's easier for you to get to Jesus instead of Saka, who we discussed last week, and he's popular for a reason. He's got very good data. But Jesus does have better data, despite not having the penalties. So I would say if you can get to Jesus and you can't get to Saka, go for it. Go for it. Honestly, I'd rather have Jesus for a free transfer, for example, than do a -8 or a -4 to get to Saka, because these might not be long-term assets anyway. I mean, nothing is over such a short span. But yeah, so for me, the players that stand out, obviously Saka, Jesus and Gabriel are the standouts. So just to sum this up, Arsenal have a good fixture, but they're not worth heavy hits. If you can add Jesus or Saka to Martinelli, you should be well set. And it's also worth mentioning again that Gabriel and White absolutely dominate Saliba. So while Saliba is, you know, a very, very high scoring defender, I would go for Gabriel over Saliba. Now, the next tip is what to do with Zaha. There's a lot of frustrated owners at the moment. And I mean, it's worth mentioning just first of all, midfielders haven't been scoring as many points as they were a couple of weeks ago. There's been a lot of midfielders that have let us down. I mean, even Saka and Foden, who we talked about, who put up incredible numbers over the last few weeks, they came out of game week 13 with a 1-pointer. So it's worth showing patience. And Palace have fixtures. I mean, Palace have very, very good fixtures. They've had good fixtures for a few weeks now. And one of the reasons we bought Zaha is because those fixtures continue up to the World Cup. So Crystal Palace have Southampton at home, West Ham away, and then Nottingham Forest away. So I'd say that's a very, very good run. And what I've put up on screen is it's a table. It's sorted, once again, it's sorted by XGI. And it shows how good Zaha has been for the money. So De Bruyne is top at 7.21. Now, I should mention these are just midfielders. I've just got midfielders. I've sorted by XGI, and they've all got either 10, 11 or 12 appearances. So these are players who are playing a lot. So De Bruyne is top 7.21. Worth mentioning, most of those are assists. So 5 of his 7.21 expected assists. So maybe not the most, attacking, but you know what De Bruyne is like. It's all about those assists. Salah is closely following De Bruyne actually at 7.06. But what's key here is his expected goals is 4.18 of that 7. So Salah, despite having some have said he's been a bit more creative this season, but looking purely at XG, he's very, very, very attacking. And he's quite a big distance ahead of Saka. So Saka at 5.89, Bowen at 5.28, Foden at 5.11, Martinelli at 4.96. We'll get to Almiron in a minute, who's actually almost matching Martinelli at 4.88, Gross 4.84, and then we got Zaha at 4.7, just ahead of Son at 4.57. So I realise I've just shouted a lot of numbers there, but I also appreciate a lot of people are going to be listening to the audio version of this. So I think what's key here is Zaha is competing very, very closely with all these other midfielders. Now, admittedly, Zaha, again, he's had penalties, which are obviously going to be helping. What we can do there, though, is we can see Zaha's had that one penalty because his non-penalty XG is 2.54, but his XG is 3.33, if that makes sense. So if you deduct that 0.72 XG that he accumulated from having a penalty, but I'd say it's quite key here. I mean, he's competing with the likes of Son. Another key thing is Zaha's had 4.7 XGI, Son's had 4.57. Zaha's actually played less games than a lot of these players, because if you remember, Palace had that game called off against Brighton a few game weeks ago. So Zaha's actually outperforming Son in a smaller number of games. So for me, when you combine those fixtures, Zaha and being on penalties, I think it's an absolute no-brainer to keep him. I'd even consider buying him still. So for me, he's going to go absolutely nowhere in my team. So just to sum that up, and people watching the video, we see we've got these new tip screens. So what to do with Zaha, keep him. Fixtures are strong. He's on penalties and competed with the best midfielders in the game for a bargain price. So I think that wraps up my thoughts on Zaha, and I guess it should be worth mentioning as well. Obviously, I'm looking at this data and I'm using my own personal interpretation on it. And in the last couple of games, especially the last one, I think off the top of my head, Zaha's XG was like 0.05. So obviously I can see why people are frustrated. But generally over the season, that's why I'm so strong on keeping Zaha. Now we're going to move into, so this is the same table as we had before, but I wanted to discuss Almiron again, just touch on it. A lot of people they've been monitoring over the last few weeks, and he continues to score. He's actually outscoring Salah at the moment. Obviously, he's played slightly more games. He's played one more game. Basically, on this list, actually, so it's the same list I just read out for those listening. Almiron and Son have played the most games, so they've actually played 12, and all these other midfielders have played 11 or 10. So Almiron has played a little more, but he's up there with, like I mentioned, he's up there with Gross, Martinelli, players like that, and 5.4 million with, again, pretty good fixtures. Because what's key with Newcastle is they've got 2 home fixtures. So they've got Villa at home. Obviously, it might be a revitalised Villa after Gerrard's got the sack, but then followed by Southampton away. And then the last game before the World Cup is Chelsea at home. Obviously, so he'll be up against Kepa. So what's interesting here, I think a lot of teams, I mean, I can talk for myself. I've already got 3 Newcastle players because I've got Pope, I've got Trippier, which seems to be a very popular combination, but I've also got Botman. So I can't really get to Almiron. I'm not going to start doing using 2 free transfers or doing a hit to get him. I just feel like there's going to be certain players you could look to remove to get Almiron in. Basically, I wouldn't force getting Almiron in. His stats are very, very good, but a lot of people are going to have players like Martinelli, Saka, Foden already. I already mentioned Zaha. They're all kind of in the same ballpark. Obviously, players like Saka and Foden are better. I'd even argue that Zaha's better because he's on penalties and he's played those less games. So I'd say it would take a very unique structure for you to need that. One player I thought of was Leon Bailey. I realised Bailey's just come off a massive haul. And maybe without Gerrard, he's going to start to improve. But someone like Bailey, I'd look at moving to Almiron. I mean, maybe even Pereira in a couple of weeks, as good as he's been. Fulham have got one more good fixture, basically. Fulham have got that game against Everton, which a lot of people are looking to start Pereira for this week. But I think 15 and 16, they play both Manchester clubs. So they play Manchester City and then they play Manchester United. So maybe at that stage, we might look coming off the Fulham assets. Maybe then Almiron will be a good pick. But I think just my problem with Almiron is, as good as he's been, it's going to be very, very hard with our teams. I think a lot of people's teams are stacked at the moment, and it's almost getting to the stage now. Now we haven't got a blank game week to plan for. I think, and all these cheap enablers have, just absolutely outperformed what we could expect in game week 13. I think it's hard to find a spot for him. So to wrap this up, keep Almiron on your radar. He's a fantastic asset if you're not already tripled up. I definitely wouldn't be selling Zaha or Salah for him, for example. But maybe someone like Bailey you could consider. But I would also say it's a bit of a luxury transfer. But he's one for me, Almiron. He's on the watch list and it's just waiting for that time to pounce. So I said there'd be a lot of tips today, so I'm sorry if I've sped through them. The final one is going to be the Game Week 4 captaincy. And I mean, as I already mentioned, most people are happy just captaining Haaland and are going to continue to do so. I think 15 and 16, so Game Weeks 15 and Game Week 16, Haaland looks like an absolute no-brainer, unless something happens in the Champions League that, changes our opinions. But I just wanted to have this discussion quickly because we're looking ahead to Game Week 14. A lot of people a lot of people didn't go Salah last week, but there was I think it was about 5% of the top 100k captain Salah over Haaland last week. I was one of them, unfortunately, but it does look like a better opportunity this week to do it. It depends. Like last week I said about risk appetite, I said they were very, very close, but if you've got that, if you want to take a gamble, if you're feeling a bit risky, you can go for Salah and hope to chase that massive upside. Obviously, it didn't come. But Salah, again, so on the screen, I've got the Rate My Team tool for Game Week 14. We've got Salah projected to get 8.48 points on average. If that game week was played hundreds of times, that would be the average output we'd expect to get from Salah. And he's ahead of Haaland at the moment, or he was last night, projected to get 6.99 points. So... And then Kane is just behind Haaland, actually, 6.36, and Son at 6.18. So again, I said it last week, I think it's just a straight shootout between Salah and Haaland. I wouldn't go looking at Spurs assets, Kane and Son. As great as Kane has been this season, I think it's a straight shootout between Salah and Haaland. And I said I was going to go for Haaland last week, and I didn't do it. I changed it about 5 minutes before the deadline. And it gives me a little bit of pause for thought, looking at this Rate My Team model and seeing Salah so high. Haaland's obviously away at Leicester, so it's not an away game, whereas Salah is at home. I could make an argument for Salah captaincy, but I'm not going to push it too hard. I think the sensible thing after last week is to captain Haaland, but it's just worth being aware. Maybe something happens in the Champions League and we decide to go for someone else that's not Haaland. I don't know. Then I think it would be a no-brainer. If Haaland didn't exist, Salah would be the best captain for this game week. So the roundup for this is that my tip is not captaining Haaland can have a huge detriment to your rank, as I found out. Salah's projected higher, but you'll be taking a huge risk if you go against Haaland. So once again, it's all about that risk appetite. So I'd like to thank you for joining me once again for the Game Week 14 tips video. I hope it was helpful. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you have any feedback. Did you prefer having 5 tips instead of 3? Obviously, maybe I had to speak a little bit faster, but I got to put through a couple more tables for you to have a look at as well. But thanks a lot. Good luck for Game Week 14, and I'll speak to you soon.